Yeah.
It's my favorite island. It's the only island I've been to.
Oh.
In Hawaii.
All right, we are live. Thank you so much for everyone that is jumping in. We'll get started with intros here in a few seconds, just kind of letting some people join. Would love, as people are jumping in, please jump into the chat and let us know, where you're joining from, maybe what's your role. If you are struggling with something around grants, you have some of your own advice, your own struggle, questions, don't hesitate to be sharing that in the chat, and we'll be able to address those things as we're going along here in the session. So please don't be shy in the comments below. We have a ton to tackle here in the next hour, so I don't want to waste any time getting to introductions and making sure you get to hear all of our amazing speakers today. Just really quickly wanted to share with everybody, this is hosted by Pond. I'm Mitch Stein, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pond. It's a marketplace for all the tools and services you need to make your nonprofit thrive. You get paid for engaging with us, just like attending this webinar. So anyone who fills out the survey at the end will automatically get $50 into their Pond account to use on all those great resources. So please make sure that you do that at the end of the session, and we'll be able to credit your account. Without further ado, let's get to the reason you're here. We are dealing with rejection today. Talking about how you can better handle grants management for your own mental health. I would love to start off by just getting introductions from our panelists, and I would love to start with you, April.
Awesome. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're streaming with us from. I'm April Walker. I'm the founder and CEO of Philanthropy for the People. It's my firm that centers racial equity in all things philanthropy and centering people with lived experience within the nonprofit sector. My background covers grant making, consulting, and fundraising in DC, Chicago, and Cleveland. And I am very happy to be here since I've been rejected, I don't know, once or twice in my career thus far. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, April. Yara, would you like to go next?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Yada, like yada, yada, yada. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Just Fund. I've been building social justice nonprofits for 25 years, and most recently, and now with Just Fund at the intersection of technology and philanthropy. And we're working to move more money through an equity-centered solution to historically excluded nonprofits and communities. And at Just Fund, we manage over 60 funds, from foundations to giving circles to family foundations, and we run over 200 grant cycles a year. And so far, we've moved over to $120 million. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Amazing. Gari, could you go next?
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Gari Monglick. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Instrumental. We are a SaaS platform. We help nonprofits with their end-to-end institutional fundraising needs. So everything from prospecting, research, collaboration, reporting, tracking. It's all in one place. It's super easy to use. This conversation is very relevant. I talk to all sorts of nonprofits who are all the way from folks that have very established, robust grant seeking processes, all the way from like new ones that are just getting started trying to evaluate if grants are the right strategy for them. So a lot of the things that we'll talk about are things that I regularly talk about with our nonprofits, and I'm excited to join this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And Corinne, could you go wrap it up for us?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Corinne Mitchell. I'm one of the co-founders of Flux and the Chief Development Officer. Flux started about 12 years ago, and in that we have, we're sort of more on the funder side of the house. So the lens that I'll be bringing to today's discussion comes from the grant maker side, the kinds of things that are moving within that space, how they're thinking about funding. Flux as a company is about 350 clients. We had about $15.7 billion go through the platform last year. So we see a lot of different permutations of grant making, from private foundations to med research to government, into communities and such as well. So that's the lens I'm bringing. I'm very honored to be a part of this panel, and looking forward to the discussion.
Amazing. All right. Well, we're centered around rejection as a lot of the topic of the discussion today. But before we go there, I would love to set the stage with a bit of 101 on grant seeking as a strategy for fundraising. Who is that the right type of organization for? When do you need a robust grant strategy? When is it maybe not the right time? Gari, I know we've talked about this before. Would love for you to kick us off, and then everyone else please jump in.
Yeah, I think the kind of the phrase that we talk a lot about is like this concept of grant readiness. And there are a lot of like checklists that you can kind of research online that will kind of take you through step by step around like what's important to have in place before you start seeking grants. I think the couple of things that are most important are you want to have a defined mission, you want to know how you're going to make an impact and kind of have a clear set of goals. And then you want to also have the capacity to deliver on the proposed programs that you'd like to raise funds for, raise grants for, and then be able to deliver back with results in a way that the funders would like to see generally. And another thing that I'll kind of point out is that grants tend to just be a longer term kind of ROI positive strategy. So you want to make sure that you have the capacity internally, capacity and knowledge to consistently apply for grants, incorporate feedback, build relationships, and be strategic. It's really hard when folks kind of want to apply to 5 grants that just kind of come across their table, and they end up getting burned with grants if they kind of don't really take a more holistic, strategic approach. But you have to make sure you have the capacity internally, which can be the catch-22 with grants.
Yara, I'd love to hear how you've seen this play out across all the organizations using Just Fund.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Gary, I really appreciate all that you shared, and I agree 100%. I think the piece I would hone in on is the time, that it takes to apply. I mean, we know it takes between 15 to 25 hours just to apply for funding, on standard, application systems. And that can amount to $5,000 for each organization, in time or opportunity cost. So, really making sure that you have that capacity and time to apply is one big piece. We've tried to streamline that process through a common application at Just Fund, which is how we center equity through our grant making. But that's not a common conventional approach to grant seeking. So I think the time is really important, and also preparing to spend time building relationships with the folks you're applying to. I think relationships are at the center of our ability to be successful with receiving grants. And so making sure that there's that time and that you've allocated to really try to be in meaningful relationship as much as possible with folks that you're really partnering with towards a common mission.
And April, I'm sure you see this a lot where people are even deciding grants versus, should I host a different event? Should I be hiring another grant writer? Could you talk us a bit through the trade-offs as compared to other fundraising strategies?
Absolutely. So I think the trade-offs of grants really require you to understand the investment that you have to make within that relationship, and in terms of reporting and following through on your end. Events have their own sort of planning and coordination effort, and individual giving is sort of up there as well with unrestricted support. But the one thing to remember with any grant management is that it's coming from a source that has their own vision, their own mission, their own values, and your ability to deliver in service to what they're trying to achieve is really the thread of that relationship. And that's why some relationships don't get renewed, or some relationships don't extend beyond that first grant period. But grants really should just be one part of the pie for all organizations, and not the only thing that is funding your goals.
And Corinne, when you see this from the funder perspective, are there kind of red flags when someone's looking at an application and you think I just don't even know if they're ready for this, or this might not be right for them?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I think in the past, yes, there was definitely a risk averseness, and we always joke, albeit it's a weird joke, but the idea that if funders, if grant foundations were funding like VCs, would they be investing in IBM? It was that level of, they tend to go for the big known impact structures. What's really interesting is the tectonic shift that's sort of going on right now, where they're recognizing that there are capacity building and things that they need to be supporting, that I think in the past they had said, well, only, they would put restrictions on things. 10% of this can go to administrative, everything else has to be programmatic, which is absolutely nonsensical. So what we're seeing actually really in an interesting evolution is the change in thought. And I think COVID had something to do with that, as we started to look at how do we reclassify funds and how do we open up general operating investment. And so that idea of being able to take a risk on smaller foundations smaller nonprofits, perhaps high impact, lower, profile organizations that are really making the most impactful contributions to the community are now on radar. The other thing that we've seen when we talk about grants as components of a fundraising strategy is sort of the build out in many ways of what foundations are starting to look at in terms of how they fund. You're looking at a lot more program related investments, loans, but even starting to look at impact investing and looking at the idea of how do we support a community that isn't the traditional route of just a grant? How do we start to make investments much like, again, someone like a venture capitalist would, to invest in technologies, infrastructure, things that I think are really going to make the difference in the overhaul of the digital infrastructure that they need to be building with the nonprofits. So I think you're seeing a change in the way people are thinking about it. I think that's a wonderful thing. One of the biggest mantras they all have right now is, let's get back to funding general operating support and have unrestricted grants. So that's a big trend that I think will also help when we talk about funders and how they're changing their mindset about how grants work.
Awesome. Yeah. And we'll definitely get back to the funder mindset and how that's evolving. I do think it's worth at this point just getting to the human level of like, rejection sucks and it's really, really hard. And like, Yara mentioned the amount of time that you're investing in something or your team's investing in something, and then they could just get a no, they could hear nothing, they could get no constructive feedback. It just feels like a dead end. I, as a startup founder, and I'm sure everyone on this panel has done some sort of fundraising or capital raising in their life, it sucks. Like what sort of personal strategies do you think about in managing kind of that pain and emotional burden? April, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you even couching this as an emotional burden, because that's what it is. After you've made such an investment and you've used your very best words and you've double checked and triple checked and you've had your peers read it and it still comes back with a no, or even worse, no communication whatsoever from the funder. For me, I always return to my why. My personal why is largely strategic reparations. I want to get as much money back to communities that I feel have been pillaged, that are intentionally under-resourced, that have just quite frankly been disregarded. And so anything I can do in service to returning what belongs to these communities is what I'm in this business for. And so that no is a no for now. The other mantra fundraisers live by, it's a no today. It doesn't have to be a no forever or a no tomorrow. So thinking about how I can get back into it. The other strategy that I often exercise is remembering the context that I'm operating in. I have colleagues, especially at the height of the pandemic, that were just receiving so many grants, so much support from organizations that now, 2 years later, no longer want to be their partners. And it's not because we no longer have people who are hungry. It's not because we no longer need food banks. It's not because the mission doesn't matter. It's because they've made a shift. Your grant is still strong. Your work is still strong. But consider the context that we're operating within. There are some social issues that, quite frankly, we're just comfortable living with. And so funders might make this brief change, but it doesn't mean it's going to be a lasting one.
Yeah, I think, for me, I treat, the relationships that I'm building with funders as, I really try to use a learning mindset, and I think about this, like we're partners. So in terms of I'm not there with a tin cup asking for money. I'm bringing something really valuable to the table. I'm bringing a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge, relationships in the community that funder needs to execute on their goals. So every time I'm thinking, I'm going to a funder, I want to know what they're trying to work on. What are their goals? They have a portfolio, they are trying to accomplish certain goals. And so I want to hear from them. What are they trying to accomplish? And then I can really couch my work in terms of trying to help them meet that goal. Because I see it as us being partners and working towards a common vision. I'm bringing the expertise, the knowledge, the relationships, the know-how, and they're bringing the money. So I have something incredibly valuable that they need. And so I want to really understand what they're working towards and how my work fits into that. And if at the end of the day, it's not the right fit and I don't understand why, I want to go to that funder and just really listen, and saying, I really thought this was a great fit for the work that you're doing. I'd really love to understand, what you were looking for. And then that opportunity also can be, used to ask, well, can you think of other folks inside the ecosystem that you think would be a good fit for me? So just really, again, I think relationships is really at the core, at the heart of fundraising. It's really just building relationships, being in relationship with knowing what you bring is really important, and valuing what you bring and understanding how that fits into, any of the funders you're approaching, and that you're really in this together. You're really partners.
I really love that. That's something that I try to have our nonprofits think about too, like really think about like coming from a position of strength and like what they have to offer. I think like another way that I try to advise nonprofits to kind of think about it is around just like actually being like coming from a position of strength, but actually being quite cynical in terms of the funders that you might partner with, like being not so optimistic and thinking that every funder is the right fit, but having a high bar for making sure that there is the right fit. And one of the things that that we help people look at on Instrumental is how open this funder is to new grantees, especially when you're going after a funder for the first time. Funders have like very different strategies. And if you can actually get that layer of insight, that can inform your whole relationship and how you might approach them. Yeah, and the other thing I would just add is that, especially if you're a new time grant seeker, it's important to, again, realize it's like a longer term kind of channel. So you do need to think about it as this learning process and kind of take a longer term arc as opposed to kind of setting expectations that you're going to have immediate results.
Yeah, I think what I've heard from the three of you so far is like, yes, you got rejected, but if you learned something, it wasn't a total waste, right? So it's like recognizing the win, even with like the pain of that, you got rejected, but you learned something. And can you get a new introduction out of it? Can you get some more information, feedback to be better set for the next time? And I think that's helpful to have something you can put in the win column at the end of the day. Corinne, I'd be curious too, how you've seen from the funder side, how they're either managing this or how they think about that burnout they could be causing, and what you've seen effectively help reduce that.
So I think the interesting part is that there's a power dynamic afoot, that those who have the money have been able to dictate the terms under which people show up and contribute information, data, their time, their energy, all the things, and then in many instances, to no avail. And I think what's interesting are a couple things. One is the first step is always awareness. I think we actually have the funders now in a position where they do understand that. There was actually an incredible group named Grant Advisors who did what's called Fix the Form. It's a survey that they sent out to 500 they sent it out broadly. 500 nonprofits from over 20 countries wrote back and gave them insights into the kinds of burden, the structures, the things that were causing them pain, anguish, and burnout. But more importantly, the kinds of things that people were asking, and what they found over the course of this quite robust survey. Not only, I think they were hoping for 100 people, they got 500, but they were able to find out that, in fact, when we look at things like what causes burnout, just pure volume of questions and structures and the things that are required, there was only about 37% in common across the multiple applications, which is both good and bad. Good meaning, well, why are we not looking at technology as a way to be able to streamline that into a common place to be able to help people so that burnout by volume doesn't occur? But also saying, you know what, are we really all that unique snowflakes that we have to have the other, portion of this be different? So I think there's this interesting sort of, again, change, a little bit of an inflection point where they're actually looking at saying, well, how do we change that? And the Fix the Form movement, while something that was probably quietly happening in the funder side, is actually informing the way that they show up. And we're starting to see a push for common apps, common data models, ways that basically break down some of the barriers that I think were causing the burnout to exist because of these myopic processes. So that's something we're really excited about. Flux is supporting it. I believe there's 5 grants management softwares covering 3,300 foundations, over 1 million nonprofits impacted, that are all adopting these practices that I will actually make sure that Even team send out to you all in case you're curious to see what those items are, what the types of questions are, the types of things people are thinking about. But I do think it's a really compelling trend that helps to, I think, take some of the undue burden off the grantee. Of course, I can't speak to the burnout on the emotional side coming from the funder perspective, but I can say that it has been heard, and that to the degree that we can start to move that needle, there are industry initiatives already afoot that are going to be releasing this year to start really easing that pain.
Yeah, it's hope is an additional answer that there's change coming, right?
Yeah.
And Yara, I know you have been all over this topic, so I would just love to get some further insight from you, and why there should be hope, like why there really is going to be change, and how that can help people in the near term.
Yeah, I think the conversations that funders are having, like the trust-based philanthropy kind of framework, new frameworks, to start to have these conversations in a more structured way with with clear solutions, like, how do we make sure our processes, our structures, our leadership, our culture really do lend themselves to more trust-filled relationships with organizations? How do we behave differently so that we do shift that power dynamic that's been so entrenched, that this group and all of us have inherited, from outdated philanthropic systems that, like April said, leaves the historically excluded organizations out of philanthropy entirely, where we have, 1.3% of all of philanthropy going to BIPOC communities. That's just unacceptable. And there's so many reasons, for why. And Corinne talked about that in terms of, the way the applications are structured, having this be such a cumbersome process with everyone having a different system, a different GMS, different questions, all these attachments. Just what do you really need to make a grant? And that's the question we started asking at Just Fund, and had some early partners who said, we really don't need that much at all. We could actually agree to a common app. And now we have 200, other funders saying, yeah, we agree to a common app, and we're going to use this platform where a group can come in, apply to one fund, and use that common app to apply to any of the other open funds. Now, I think one of the big challenges is philanthropy is still not very open, right? I mean, it's still very relationship driven. So most of the funds that even we manage are by invitation only. So what does that mean? I mean, even if you have a common app solution, you still have to have the relationships and the networks to be able to apply for funding, because philanthropy is, by its very nature, incredibly exclusionary and expensive, for people to be able to be a part of that system. So I think there are still some big changes that need to happen in terms of, funders being open, like as Gary said, to building new relationships with organizations. And what are the mechanisms for doing that? One of the mechanisms I'm seeing is an increase in collaborative funds, almost like a springboard, a way for funders to get to know a group without taking a big risk. You're pooling your funds with other funders, joining your funds with other funders into a pooled fund, a collaborative fund, where you're sharing some of the risk. And it gives that funder a chance to really get to know an organization from one of multiple funders, and then be able to bring that group into their portfolio. So there are some of those tools I'm starting to see really gaining more traction.
That's awesome. And April, I'd love to this point about the equity issue. I think a lot of people nod their heads and say like, oh yeah, it's an equity issue, but they don't really understand like what the individual impact is. Could you unpack that a little bit further even than Yara did?
Gladly. Yeah. So these relationships, right? Do they exist at country clubs? Do they exist in communities that are comprised of people that look like me? Do they exist at grocery stores? Are they happening at church, after school programs? You can very well be connected to people that have family foundations and donor advised funds, and know someone that's leading up a foundation and be funneling money to an organization. You're not even thinking about it. What we see year after year, even after the pandemic, is that organizations that are led by a Black or brown person get fewer dollars, and those dollars have more restrictions. So equity is work that we all have to individually do and collectively do and commit to. And that means funders and foundations have to rethink how they're in relationships with these other organizations. It means they need to give catalytic support to these organizations. It means they should maybe stop asking how these organizations plan to sustain themselves if they themselves are not going to give above and beyond what they've given white-led organizations. So that power dynamic, it's really incumbent upon everyone to play their role. I often empower fundraisers and grant seekers to ask the questions of the funders that they're being asked. So for example, I was on a call with a bank that had ample questions for us that they had never had before about our DEI journey. And I was so happy to ask them the same thing, knowing that the historical roots of said bank were public information and rooted in pillaging communities from resources they had no right to. So you do have the ability, and if you were empowered either by your board or your leadership to sort of go toe for toe within those conversations and dialogues to say, hey, 80 questions for $5,000 is a little bit extreme. And also to take your proposals face up and share them with other organizations. Hey, so-and-so, this is what I just submitted to this funder over here. Can we use this as a starting point for our conversation to save yourself some work?
I absolutely agree with you. By the way, I think there's an openness now amongst funders to say, can we accept what someone has already put through, especially when we start thinking about, someone that has received a grant as well. If we've already gone through the compliance, the due diligence, can you accept this as sort of a structure that would streamline the process in a more obviously efficient way. So I absolutely see that starting to take hold as well, April.
Because quite frankly, you have families that are giving out money, you have communities that are giving out money, and those communities are homogenous. And you're asking an organization, a nonprofit, that may also be homogenous or may not, and you're going to critique and rank them on that when you have your own work to do. We should be journeying together. We should not only be ranking and assessing one another within this equity context.
Yeah, and we've gotten a few great comments in the chat. I just want to reiterate for anyone who joined late, please drop questions in. We'll take them as we go. We don't need to wait till the end. So as things spark questions, thank you, Laura and Shalia, for dropping those things in there. One thing that I would love to hear from you, Gari, as you work with people on your platform, like, do you have a way for people to almost proactively be prepared for the no? Like, I was talking to someone about the topic, a nonprofit leader earlier this morning, and they were like, oh, I love that topic. I used to tell my team to celebrate when they get no's because we're getting closer to the right answer. We're getting closer to the right partner and just totally shifting the attitude. Would be curious your thoughts there.
That's a good question. We do a lot to try to kind of, like I said before, kind of level set expectations, like through any kind of interaction you'll have with us. We're trying to like coach you through the grant process, and then we'll try to give you as many insights as possible on like how aligned a funder or a grant program really is to what you're looking for. And then the thing that we try to do is we try to build a process for you, right? We make it really easy for this to not just be a bunch of applications you're applying to, but to actually create a calendar where you can like easily kind of keep track of tasks and deadlines and things like that. So it becomes, sometimes folks come to us and they're just like, I just need one grant for one thing. And then, we have to kind of pull them out of that into seeing a bigger potential system and strategy that they could use. And so I think that's kind of how we navigate that.
Yeah, and I think what you're raising, which is really important to lift up, is just like the more organized you are and like you've set your goals, you know what you're trying to do, like the more you establish that up front, especially across a team, you're now level setting for everybody. So there's clarity and vision, and that helps with like, we knew we were going to get some rejections. It's okay. This is part of the plan. And it's just helping reduce the stress, I think, when it's all clear and laid out in front of you. With that, I think it might be helpful to chat about like, how are you managing those programs, and how, like, when is the right time to be investing in a new piece of technology and getting something out of your Excel spreadsheet? And I don't know if Yara, you want to take this one first? Obviously, everyone can chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gari is going to have had a lot more experience working with organizations, and when they start to invest in a piece of technology, I mean, what I see is, a lot of investment happening on the customer, like treating the relationships with funders like a customer support journey, really more in like the kind of the CRM kind of model of like trying to figure out what part of the funnel you're trying to expand, whether it's just, I want to prospect and start to build new relationships and bring people at the widest part of just increase awareness all the way through, like as you're getting to know an organization and bringing them into like acquisition of like, I'm actually having a conversation with them, all the way through to like re-granting, right? And recurring grants. So which part of the funnel are you focusing on? And I think having that structured mindset's really useful for, an organization, that this isn't, a willy-nilly kind of approach, but really being structured around it. In order to get the 5 grants I need at, $25,000 each, I'm going to have to open up that funnel, and I need to be going after 25 funders. And I, want people at different stages of that journey. So I think, we talked at the beginning, you need to make sure you have the time to really manage thoughtfully a grants program, and having technologies like what Gari's built and like HubSpot, and all these different systems really can make this work so much easier, where you're thinking about it systematically. You're still adding that personal touch and thinking about that personal relationship, but you have some automations and some systems in place to really move people through a very thoughtful journey as they're building that relationship with you as well.
I think one thing I'd also note that I've seen in my experiences around the idea that there is a lot of transience in the nonprofit community. By having things not in a tool, there is the cost of transitions in the sort of oral tradition being lost. So to the degree that you can codify pieces through a CRM specifically is always a great place to start. That digital infrastructure, the elements of making you successful in that, does include having tools and tech to support that historical view and to be able to understand how we progressed over time. So I think understanding and maybe starting with the CRM is always a fantastic place, but of course I will defer to the experts on this. I can just reflect that that is on people's mind on really what does that mean? How do we make sure that both the data tools and tech are in place so that you are protecting your legacy as well?
Can I briefly underscore and just emphasize that point? I think especially right now as nonprofits and really all of us are experiencing a great resignation. There are a lot of organizations that are going to have a lapse in institutional knowledge. They're going to have a lapse in some of this relationship knowledge, and the tools are as good as you make them, given your quality input with your data integrity. But it's so helpful to have one so that you can have some continuity of understanding of what this relationship has been like in a historical context as board members leave, as staff members leave, as EDs shift. It's so invaluable, essentially.
Yeah, Gori, I brought up Anissa's question here, and I'm sure you can add on to Yara and Corinne's and April's comments too, but maybe tie that into some advice for new folks to grant seeking.
Sure. I actually can't see Anissa's question.
Oh, she said, any advice for a new professional just starting out with writing grants?
Okay. Yeah. I think all the points made were great. One thing I would add is just kind of coming back to the capacity piece, which I know is a challenge. But like we can, like Instrumental, for example, a lot of other tools can do a lot of great things for you. With Instrumental, you can apply for grants more quickly. Like we can almost double the output while saving you time. But the reality is you still have to actually be there doing the things and like spending your time. So if you don't really have that capacity internally, that may not be, then it might be more challenging to kind of make the case to invest in the technology. So I think the time and the capacity, the investment comes first in terms of time. And then you'll be able to really leverage this technology to like multiply whatever your efforts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just add on to that. I love that. It depends on what you're starting out with. I mean, it's the prospecting. There's different layers of what we need to do to start getting started writing grants, the prospecting and knowing who you're reaching. And like what Corinne was saying with Fix the Form, they have identified the 37% overlap of what are the common questions. So you can actually start to solidify that in a Google Doc. What are those common questions every funder is going to ask me, and get that really structured so that you're saving time when you go in to apply. You've got that 37% overlap there for you, whether it's what's your mission, what are you trying to accomplish, what are the 3 outcomes you're looking for, this year, all those kinds of basic pieces that are common to every proposal, making sure you have that set so that when you get to the unique parts of each application, you can spend the majority of your time there versus rewriting all of that, conventional pieces of your proposal. So that's one tip that I would give.
I love that. And I absolutely agree. And just so you're aware, Eve will be posting, I sent her the link for the Fix the Form. The questions are in there, the top ones that you can take a look at. So there's a way to kind of get started on that. So I would definitely agree entirely with Yada on this. I think it's fantastic to have a database, even if it's a Google Doc that helps you to answer these quickly. And at some point, technology can start to bring in those databases too. I know we're looking at it as well as I'm sure other tools to say, are there ways to help people take in a common data set of questions they've already answered? So that's definitely the next step for technology as well.
Yeah, and I would also just add on to that it's a great way when you're talking about getting started with grant writing. If it's the same question that overlaps on all these different applications, probably means it's the most important questions too. And so that's a great place to start at really understanding what your answers as an organization are. If you need to do some interviewing, right? If you've just started, so you're trying to learn the institutional knowledge from leaders, you can really hone in on, well, I know these 10 questions are going to be on everyone. So I want to get everyone's take on this. And that's a really good way to build your own ground level. April, I don't know if you had anything to add on just like new to the field. What are your best tips for making the most of that really more specific role when the org does have capacity for a grant writer as a full-time role?
Yeah, absolutely. There are some foundations that will put examples on their websites of very strong proposals. At a minimum, they share what they funded in the previous year. So you can develop your own relationships with other development officers and development teams to ask them how they've approached a certain organization. But asking a program officer directly, would you mind sharing, even if it's a redacted version of the strongest proposal you've received lately, so we can sort of begin to craft our programs and outcomes? Many will share with you, many won't redact. Again, I know several that just have strong proposals and examples on their websites directly. So looking through some of those and asking a program officer if they're willing, when they're not in the middle of a grant cycle, to look at a draft and sort of work through some of that language with you. Many will do that.
Awesome. Great ideas. One thing I'm curious about is I've seen a lot of folks asking for a part-time grant writer or wondering, is it the right time to bring on a part-time grant writer? Should I hire someone full-time? What do I need? I don't know. And I would just open this up to the group because I don't know who's got the best feedback on it. But do you have any guidance on when is the right time and how to think about that kind of addition to the team?
One of my favorite classes in business school was process flow management. And in process flow management, you pay attention to where the bottlenecks are in your process flow. So when it comes to like getting funding, if one of the big bottlenecks is I don't have time to write grants, that's, I think, a really big clue that you need to bring in extra capacity to do that piece of the process flow. So I think if as a founder or wherever you are in the organization, you're seeing, gosh, everything's piling up at this point. I know who to apply to, but I just don't have the capacity to start writing these grants. That's when you need to bring in capacity, and you can try it, with a contractor first, and then see if it is useful, if it's actually getting you the grants that you need, and then you can, think about making that investment in a full-time writer. But that's what I would really pay attention to is like, where are you getting stuck? And if that's a key part, then start looking at that capacity.
One other framework that I might offer is around validation and like experimentation. Like if you're just getting started, either as a newer organization and you're just getting started with grants, or if you're an established organization but you haven't really done grants before, it can be helpful to kind of think about it as like you're going to hire an expert that's going to help validate this strategy for you. And then once you have that flywheel spinning, it can make sense at that point, and you'll have the capacity and the resources at that point to potentially make a full-time hire.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great feedback. And I would just add, even from an early startup, which I think aligns a lot to especially small nonprofits, anytime you can get a contractor to do something first before you hire someone full-time, take it. Definitely, it might seem like it's maybe a little bit more expensive, but oh my God, just being able to validate with someone that has experience and can even like help you get set up to hire someone full-time. I just think it is always best to find an external person that can, and by the way, best case scenario is you both really like each other and then they come on full-time eventually. Worst case scenario is it doesn't go well and they're a contractor and you don't have any ongoing obligation to them. So it's a real win-win.
I love what Gary said. Just to second that, I hadn't thought about it that way, but it's such a great way to bring an external eye to what you're doing and even help you crystallize, especially if you're like a one-person show, which many of us are in the nonprofit world, to bring in that extra validation, to clarify what it is that you're doing. What are they seeing as the core elements of your work? Bringing in that person almost even, as a sounding board to what you're doing and a validator. I love that.
And I'm going to add one more thing to that, just to validate that. But the idea then bringing an expert in, oftentimes the hardest thing is to construct new processes, new structures, and re-engineer yourself. The people that you can bring in with the expertise will be able to do this in a much more they'll have a much more focused expertise to be able to deliver that. Then you can bring someone on full-time, either them or someone else to be in the delivery and execution, which is a different skill set. So sometimes it actually does merit having someone who is external to come in and lend insight into the shadows that you may not be able to see.
Yeah, and I think with that, I would love to just more generally, as all of you see so many organizations seeking grants, like what does your all-star grant fundraiser look like? What do they do best? And how are they most successful? April, if you want to kick that one off.
Yeah, I love this question. For me, I'm mindful of folks that are telling a very complete and comprehensive narrative. And so if you're asking for program support year in and year out, that's great. But when's the last time you've taken a look at how much the organization needs to increase wages, get wages competitive, increase benefits, to really change the culture of an organization? Those things have numbers as well and are finite. And those often aren't the things that we're messaging sometimes to our philanthropic partners. And especially right now, I was with a program officer just yesterday, and she was sharing how so many organizations have received PPP loans. So now they have financials in the black. And my next question was, that doesn't mean that people are being paid the wages they deserve. That doesn't mean the staff feels valued. That doesn't mean they've had any professional development for the past decade. And so how have you sort of set those internal organizational goals alongside some of these more programmatic or general operating goals that you also have to tell that complete story of what it's like actually working at a nonprofit? Because we know there's burnout, not just in development, but case management as well. Some of these frontline positions that really need support. And we need to express the value of that and ask the funders to meet us entirely, not halfway, meet us all the way there with paying people what they deserve.
The couple things that I see that all-star customers or all-star folks might do. One is like kind of going back to what Yara mentioned before around coming from a position of strength. So just having that perspective about what you have to offer, which I think then leads to a more discerning strategy in general, with making sure that the funders are truly aligned, making sure the funders are actually open to building new relationships. If they're not, then actually being discerning about how you might approach them. So like you might not just, apply cold, you might really invest in like building that relationship first if you see that only 10% of their grants go to new grantees. And then the other aspect is just kind of going back to that process. So instead of it being about just applying for a couple of grants here and there with whatever kind of comes by your desk, it's really about thinking holistically about what does your strategy look like for the next at least like 2 years. I would say if you're just getting started, you want to think at least 2 years out, and how you want to have a system where you're consistently applying for grants, taking that feedback in, incorporating that into your process, and just getting better, so that by the end of like a year of doing it, a year and a half of doing it, you're really starting to build relationships and starting to actually have the expertise in-house to be successful.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, data is really important. Understanding what you're accomplishing is really important. But really, I love data to be able to tell a great story. I think some of the most successful fundraisers are the best storytellers, to really understand, from how your organization is impacting real people, and benefiting real people, and being able to bring that kind of, story, that aspirational kind of alignment to a funder. I think that's a really important piece to being a successful fundraiser.
Yeah. And Corinne, how have you seen those storytelling capabilities come across and really stand out to funders and resonate with their specific goals and objectives?
I think they've struggled because there's this push and pull between evidence-based grant making and trust-based grant making. And while you're starting to see people split between the two, they're asking for data, but they're like, we're trust-based, which makes, it's like they're still grappling with what it all means. But that said, things like being able to look at, progress reports, something as basic as that are a huge pain in the butt, that, to be honest, oftentimes for the nonprofits are an incredible amount of time and energy, and then are oftentimes logged somewhere into a folder with the foundations. And you have to question, are you doing anything with this information? I think what we're starting to see is a transition to being able to accept oral reports, to be looking at opportunities within that trust-based philanthropy kind of realm that say, how do we make it part of the discussion so it's real time, so that we can recalibrate as we go, instead of having these, to be honest, rose-colored glasses every 6 months that are like, I just need to get funding continued. So like, we're going to tell the story that makes sense, that no one's, getting benefit from. So I think that we're starting to see a big push right now. I was actually on a call this morning, right before this, with what we call our client advisory board, which is our top 14 clients that are sort of most involved in the community. And that was one of the major topics they talked about, was this idea of data is not just about, this evidence-based structure to be able to tell the impact story. It's about oral reports. It's about codifying this in. So I think we're seeing a transition in that I haven't actually, it was all lip service maybe a couple months ago, and we're actually seeing a big initiative on many of their radars, both in terms of what they're telling us to be able to do, but what they're doing themselves around oral reports in 2022.
Yeah, just reinforcing that point that Corinne's making. I mean, we have, we support, as I mentioned, hundreds of grant cycles of folks who I would think fall more aligned with the trust-based philanthropy side of the
absolutely
of the group. And I'm seeing, 95% of our funders don't even collect reports anymore. My hypothesis is, with the Common App, you're saving so much time, that you now have this capacity freed up to actually be in meaningful relationship with your groups, doing 30-minute calls throughout the, the grant period. But we even also have a function where you can do video, updates,
Right.
just to kind of be on video, even applications. So some funders are just having more elasticity in the way that they're accepting, whether it's audio, video, or written reporting to, and even applications.
I think it's actually a really interesting contrast because Just Fund does such a beautiful job of showing up in that realm, and in a way that honestly, Flux, we are going to represent a lot more of the legacy foundations who are going to be the laggards to, bless their heart, come to the table and change things. At the same point, they're also honoring a fairly large amount of dollars, and they have intrinsic change management. I think Yada offers this opportunity for folks that are coming into funding to be able to really rethink and just completely overhaul the way that they're working. I think that's a really powerful thing that her organization does. But I also, applaud people that are coming in and saying, how do I question and have that courageous moment to say, what am I really doing? How do I really want to impact and show up for our grantees? And that conversation is the one that's starting to happen. I think, again, on Flux's side, we represent a lot of the more legacy ones. And that's something that we have to sort of coerce them into thinking, saying there are all these options of what you can do, what would you like to do? But I do think that we're seeing sort of a transition of the legacies, but a lot of people are just able to leapfrog. And I think that's so powerful what Just Fund is doing in that sense.
That's awesome. And I would ask a slightly different question, April, of what's something that you see grant seekers spend a ton of time on that actually doesn't matter to the funder, or something that they overemphasize and isn't even that impactful into how they seek funding?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think it really depends because you have funders with these varying priorities. I will see a lot of folks spend a lot of time on formats or on making sure documents are pretty, et cetera, when really sometimes it's the content. And then you do have funders that will dock you if you have a typo or if you have something that's not perfectly buttoned up. So it does depend. But I do think, to the previous conversation, bringing the heart to the front. So bringing the story to the front, going beyond sometimes not making the reader determine what the data means. So making sure that you're telling them what you're supporting and putting it again in that larger context, in the larger narrative. What does it mean for this specific community? What does it mean for the future of this specific community? Are there political initiatives that are intersecting with the way your nonprofit can or cannot expand? But I think probably the thing that more fundraisers should be doing is just asking the question of the specific foundation that you're submitting the proposal to so that you can meet them exactly where they are, because it's not a one size fits all for folks that haven't adopted a common app model, or folks that are not quite there on their trust-based journey, to ask, do you mind if this is what we're doing? We're thinking about doing this. We've shared this style with another organization. Can we share it with you?
I absolutely agree. I think that's something you should always feel the courage to say, because I think people are trying to figure out what this means. And oftentimes a foundation's view may be myopic, again, to what they know. And if you offer them a different reality that gets them to that same business result or that same end result, I think it's a really powerful place. Again, not just to be able to ensure that you're helping your own organization to scale, but also resetting that power dynamic that we talked about earlier. That's incredibly important to be able to ensure you have a voice at the table. And there's a lot of pressure right now on grant makers and funders to say, how do you show up for the grantee? Some of them need your help understanding where they can do that.
Yeah, the power dynamic piece is just, I know we've touched on that a few different times, but I think what the problem it presents is like, yeah, of course, I would love to go to that funder and say like, no, really, I need overhead funding, or no, I really need longer term funding to do this thing. But if I don't see that in their form, or like, who am I to say that? Could I be jeopardizing our funding if it sounds like I'm complaining? What are some practical tips? I'm sure all of you have them, but what are some practical tips for someone who's in that, like at that losing end of the historical power dynamic? Like what is in their control? Like how can they advocate for better types of funding? I don't know if Gari, you want to start with that, or Yada?
Yeah, Yara, you can take it away.
I think there are some great practical tips. I mean, to me, and what Fix the Forum and other folks are in trust-based philanthropy are saying too, it's not just, we're really looking for as grant seekers, multi-year funding, people who can walk with us, right? We need infrastructure. We need not just the rapid response, like quick emergency funding, but people who are going to really be on this journey with us. And so one of the things is, if you have a funder who's giving you X amount, can you convert some of that into multi-year to kind of give yourself more time to be in a relationship with them, and also stretch out, be able to plan better for your growth. So one of the things I've done with funders in the past, if they gave me like $100,000, I'd say, and I had the ability to spread that out, like I wasn't going to have to like lose staff, I would say, could I actually turn that into a multi-year grant? And then can I do 50,000 over 2 years? So this is going to help me plan and help me hire people that I can actually keep for a longer period of time. And of course, what that does is it builds a stronger relationship between you and that funder. And it gives you more time to be in relationship with them, to hopefully the next time when you submit a renewal, you're able to say, okay, now how about $100,000 a year for 2 years? You saw what we were able to do together. So you have more time to build trust with the funder and show them what you can do. So that's just one tip I would offer.
One other thing that comes to mind is basically like data, right? Like from all the funders that kind of give grants, all that data is available. So if there's something there that could kind of help build a case, or at least help you ask questions to the funder to say, hey, like, I think I'm doing kind of similar work. Like, does it make sense for you to extend the same amount to my organization, or at least start to like have the conversation, because you now know what they've given to other grantees. And then the other piece that I think is interesting is, the first grant you get is just the beginning of the relationship. And so through tools like Instrumental and others, you can see like what the giving has looked like for repeat grantees. And so that can also help extend that relationship, where maybe this is just the first place, but you can kind of collaborate with the funder to figure out how might that relationship expand into the years to come.
One of the things I also wanted to add is, obviously programmatically, you guys have a strong hold on what you're doing, what the community, the dedication is to, where you're showing up for them. I think that oftentimes when we look at some of the other things as the team mentioned, around how do we support and ask for things around the digital infrastructure, sometimes we're lacking words that make sense to the funder. And I wanted to share, and this is something Eve will actually put through as well to the chat, the elements of digital infrastructure. When you're talking to it, there are sort of 6 components that are widely understood by funders. And this is actually a thing that's been broadcasted across entire networks of funders. And it's done through the NetHope N10 and TAG groups. But they talk about rights and equity, access, tools and tech, data, resourcing, skills. And these are the 6 ways that when you talk about needing to update your infrastructure and ask for grants that are not just programmatic, but are helping you to build out, the build out of Instrumental, Just Fund, and things like that. These are sort of words that will resonate with them. So I wanted to make sure you guys had that, because I think it's something that would resonate as you look at funders to say these are words and structures they're aware of, and are starting to say, well, how do we help fund the build out of this element, of these elements inside of the digital infrastructure for our nonprofits. So hopefully having some words that resonate in a common language, will assist your efforts too. So I wanted to make sure you knew that link was coming through as well.
Yeah. I love that. That's great. And then I also think, there is education that you're doing with your donors. So when someone says I would never go to a donor and say, I need more for overhead. The people are the most important part of anything we're doing. And so I would never my people deserve, like April said, better wages, professional development. We need to support their own growth, and that's the most important investment we can make is in our team. I fully believe that. And I think when you're going to a funder, you want to, convey that confidence that you want to put your team first. Like that's what makes this organization so unique is, the people that work here and love this organization and love the communities that we're serving. So I think that framework is really important. And then the other piece, Corinne mentioned having a client advisory board. I think, a lot of us don't have capacity to manage another board, but thinking about your existing funders as part of a board, informal or formal, where they are your ambassadors, and really thinking about ways to activate them, so with a donor who's been with you for a couple of years, now they're they really believe in you. They're your, either formal or informal ambassador. And so what can they be doing to help open the door for you? Can you be thinking about asking each funder, to open 5 doors? Or could you think of 3 people that you could introduce me to, and really activating that network that you're building for yourself and for your organization?
I think especially for organizations that are community-based and do have Black or Brown EDs or executive directors at the helm, working in collaboration, that's a community-centric approach to what your entire grant strategy is, your fundraising strategy is. I also want to underscore, Mitch, specific to your question about power dynamics, that having power, having wealth, having resources does not mean you have any expertise. And so the key word from the previous comment was really education. You're constantly educating your board members. You're educating the other people on your team. I love nothing more than when people will bring me news clippings or articles. Hey, I heard about this grant. It's out of state, it's out of context, it's out of the country, but at least they're thinking in the realm of this is what philanthropy is, this is what we could do, and sort of speaking to that vision. So just stay sort of grounded in the fact that the people with the lived experience here are the absolute experts and should be the ones at the table helping to craft their own decisions. And that's not currently the way that philanthropy is structured, but we can work in service to that. And we can call out, respectfully so, professionally so, bad actors in the space, and we should.
Yep.
Yeah, and something all of you were touching on that I hadn't even thought of is just the importance of vocabulary and language, and making sure that you're speaking the common language. So I know there was a question in the chat about the link to what Corinne was mentioning. Yes, we're sending a summary around of this whole conversation. We will include links to all those resources. So just make sure at the end, Barbara in particular, that if you fill out the survey, just make sure we've got your email so that you'll get that recap when it's ready. And then my last question for everybody, I know we've just got a few minutes left, is just like, where are things going? When we're looking into the future, and all of us are connected to tech in some ways too, like, what are the next 3 to 5 years bringing us? And what is your greatest hope for how kind of the grants industry will change and evolve for the better? Sorry, there's a big question for there being 4 minutes left, but maybe each of you can try to take a minute and chime in on that. And we can start with you, Yada.
Yeah, I think the big change I'm seeing is in this common app. We have the biggest foundations in the United States working together on a common app. That's really exciting, and for the funds and foundations that we work with, people are very excited about the idea of streamlining the process for grant seekers. And they also realize how that saves time on their side. There's a real advantage to having their team actually freed up to do the transformative piece of grant making, which is being in relationship with versus spending time on the administrative side, trying to get a hold of all these questions and answers that they have to now, sift through. I think that's one big thing. And this is not necessarily a technology, but I think it's a shift that I'm seeing, which is a big increase in participatory grant making and activist-led grant making. So the technology moving to where it's easier for activists to be able to score proposals or, offer feedback and actually be able to make decisions for funders, where funders are giving over power in terms of where the money goes. So I think, the Common App, participatory grant making are two really big technologies that I'm seeing kind of moving forward. And I think we'll see more of that over the next several years.
Corinne, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In terms of how can technology serve as a hand that reaches out to connect folks, to connect to communities, that's incredibly important. So this idea of being able to mirror the ways that people are already working has to happen. And we as technologists, it's incumbent on us to reflect that through. The future, I agree, is quite collaborative. And that's something that's very powerful. And it takes common denominators in the form of common data, whether that be things that are, whether it's the SDGs or Candid or, the CDM, all the things that you're hearing about, they are all valid. They are all interesting. They're all creating a common denominator for us to be able to work together and to use that into a common application, which then in the context of that solidifies a way for us to all be able to ensure that you as nonprofits are arriving to the most efficient process possible, and that we as technologists are adopting that standard. So I think it's an interesting moment where the power is obviously shifting, as mentioned. And obviously, I think the key part here is voicing your ideas. If you do have strong opinions, you have strong, ideas of where we as funders can show up for you, you got to get those out there. And I think people are more than willing to listen. So I'm excited about the collaborative nature, because it's not just about the platform, the technology, but it's about the conversation that's occurring.
Awesome. Gari, where's tech going?
Yeah, I think Yara and Corinne are much more kind of versed in kind of talking about the increase in like transparency and the shift in dynamics. I think from my perspective, we are a very product and technology focused company. That's like, I think, where we like how we think and how we just like run the company. And so when we talk about grant seeking, there's like all these different components, right? From prospecting, research, tracking, collaboration, reporting, post-award grant management. there's still a ton of work that needs to go into those processes, a ton of like inefficiencies, manual work that we have a really long roadmap that we're excited to work through to just make that much more streamlined.
Awesome. And April, you get the last word here before we wrap up for the day.
No pressure. I would echo everything that was shared and underscore participatory grant making, making sure that grant makers, quite frankly, are getting out of the way and ceding some of the power that they have and thinking in line with reparations and strategic reparations in that sense, and more direct cash assistance, quite frankly, for communities that need that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody that joined today. Thanks for the great questions in the chat. Feel free to continue to share those questions with us, and we'd love to give feedback. As I mentioned, we're going to have a recap. This video will be available. It'll become a podcast. You can share it far and wide. So much good knowledge here for everyone that is grant seeking and grant making, for that matter, to be listening to. Just make sure that you are filling out your survey so that Pond can give you $50 in your Pond account. So don't forget about that. You can use this link. It'll also be on the Pond website. About the webinar. You can just click on this session and click to go to the survey. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you right here next week, Thursday at noon, for our next session.